It wasn't the arrival that stunned palace watchers, it was the exit. Princess Catherine reportedly entered the private suite quietly and left without a word. Staff looked away. Conversations stopped, and within minutes, whispers spread through royal circles, who had been invited into a room no one expected to share. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What happened next depends entirely on who is telling the story. No official statement confirmed discomfort. No palace briefing acknowledged tension. And yet, according to circulating reports and interpretations from royal observers, something about that brief appearance immediately triggered a level of speculation usually reserved for moments of genuine institutional concern. The gathering itself was never expected to attract attention. By most accounts, it was understood to be private, controlled, and limited in attendance. These kinds of palace meetings are often described as quiet administrative moments, short conversations, routine hospitality, familiar faces, nothing designed to create headlines, which is why the reports that unexpected personal guests had also been present became the detail everyone fixated on. According to various interpretations now spreading across royal commentary spaces, Princess Catherine is believed to have arrived expecting a far more contained setting. The expectation, observers claim, was discretion, familiar protocol, a limited circle. Instead, accounts began suggesting that additional attendees described in some commentary as individuals personally connected to Queen Camilla's broader social world had already been welcomed into the space. That detail alone changed everything. Not because royal households never receive guests. They do, constantly. But because within royal culture, context is everything. Timing matters, invitations matter, expectations matter, and private spaces inside royal environments often carry invisible boundaries that outsiders never fully see. Reports differ sharply on what happened in the following minutes. Some interpretations suggest nothing dramatic occurred at all, that the encounter was polite, brief, and ordinary. Others insist there was a visible shift in atmosphere almost immediately after Catherine entered. Palace staff, according to several speculative accounts, allegedly became noticeably restrained. Conversations softened. Movements became measured. No one agrees on exactly what was said. What people continue talking about is what allegedly was not said. Because according to those same interpretations, Catherine did not appear upset in any obvious way. There was reportedly no confrontation, no exchange, no visible disagreement. She simply left. And that silence became louder than any explanation. Observers who follow royal appearances closely began attaching meaning to details that, under normal circumstances, might have passed unnoticed. The timing of her departure, the absence of clarification, the fact that attention shifted immediately from the gathering itself to Catherine's reaction. Within hours, entirely different theories began forming. Some framed the moment as routine scheduling overlap exaggerated by public curiosity. Others interpreted it as a subtle sign of competing expectations inside royal life, different approaches to privacy, hospitality, and personal boundaries. And then there were those who believed the moment revealed something larger altogether. Not conflict, not scandal, but something quieter and potentially more complicated. Because institutions rarely reveal pressure through dramatic declarations. More often, people notice changes through pauses, exits, and moments that seem too small to matter, until everyone starts asking the same question at once. If there truly was discomfort, where did it begin? And if there wasn't, why did so many people immediately believe there had been? Because palace discomfort rarely begins with a single moment, it begins with who opened the door. Royal spaces are more than rooms, they are symbols. And when boundaries blur behind palace walls, every gesture suddenly carries meaning far beyond etiquette. That was the question now hanging over the story, not whether anyone had broken a rule, but whether something far older had quietly been tested. Because within royal life, private suites have never simply been private. They exist in a strange space between family and institution, comfort and protocol, intimacy and symbolism. To the outside world, A room is a room. Inside the monarchy, rooms often become language. Who enters matters. Who invites matters. Who belongs there and who does not can become the subject of endless interpretation. That is why moments that appear ordinary on paper can become explosive in perception. Over generations, access inside royal circles has been treated less as hospitality and more as structure. There are public spaces designed for appearances, semi-private settings reserved for formal relationships, and then there are areas that traditionally operate under an entirely different understanding, places associated not with ceremony but trust. Observers of royal customs often point to an unwritten principle that has survived decades of change. Access reflects hierarchy, and hierarchy reflects stability. Not because the monarchy is cold, because continuity depends on predictability. And that distinction matters. Reports surrounding this gathering never suggested anyone had done something forbidden. Instead, interpretations focused on something more difficult to define. Expectation. Some commentary questioned whether a private environment had briefly shifted into something more personal. Others argued that modern royal life no longer fits old boundaries, and that reading too much into guest lists reveals more about public fascination than palace reality. But the conversation kept returning to one uncomfortable idea. When does hospitality become overlap? And when does overlap become symbolism? Royal households have always balanced two worlds at once. One is institutional, carefully managed, deliberate, designed around continuity. The other is personal friendships, loyalties, familiar circles built over years and carried quietly into public life. Most of the time, those worlds coexist without friction, until observers believe they collide. According to circulating interpretations, that is why this particular moment drew attention. Not because anyone accused anyone of wrongdoing, not because there was confrontation, but because different people appeared to interpret the same room in entirely different ways. One reading suggested warmth and openness. Another suggested blurred lines. And once those competing narratives formed, they began attaching themselves to something larger than the event itself. Questions emerged about evolving roles. Questions about influence. Questions about how different generations inside the royal family define space, protocol, and belonging. None of those questions came with answers. But they created atmosphere. An atmosphere inside royal life has a way of becoming its own kind of pressure. Because institutions rarely feel tension through dramatic declarations. More often, pressure arrives quietly, through assumptions, through expectations left unspoken, through moments that seem insignificant, until everyone realizes they have interpreted them differently. That may explain why the conversation never truly centered on the guests themselves. It shifted towards something harder to dismiss. Why this moment? Why now? Why did an ordinary gathering suddenly feel loaded with meaning? Because if royal stories teach anything, it is that context changes everything. And this wasn't only about guests, it was about timing. In royal life, timing can say more than statements ever do. By the time conversations about private suites and unexpected company began circulating, attention had already started drifting somewhere else entirely. People were no longer asking only what happened inside the room. They were asking whether the moment had landed differently because of everything that had come before it. Royal stories rarely exist in isolation. Every appearance, every schedule adjustment, every absence, every return becomes part of a larger narrative, whether anyone inside the institution intends it or not. And in recent years, public attention surrounding Catherine's role has intensified in ways that transformed ordinary moments into subjects of national interpretation. That pressure changes how people watch. A delayed appearance becomes a discussion. A revised calendar becomes a theory. A routine engagement becomes evidence for stories that may not even exist. So when reports began describing this private gathering and Catherine's quiet departure, many observers didn't treat it as a standalone event. They placed it into a timeline that already existed in their minds. Commentary started drawing connections. Recent public appearances were revisited. Schedules were compared. Harmless details suddenly gained weight simply because people were searching for patterns. Some interpreted Catherine's recent public role as one increasingly centered on steadiness and measured visibility, a figure associated with consistency, calm, and disciplined presentation. Others argued that expectations around her had become so heightened that even ordinary decisions were now being interpreted through an impossible standard. That difference in perception created the perfect environment for speculation. Because when expectations rise, silence becomes louder. Reports and commentary surrounding family dynamics added another layer. Some royal observers suggested that the institution had entered a period of subtle adjustment, new routines, shifting responsibilities, different priorities behind closed doors. Others rejected that entirely, arguing that royal households constantly adapt and that outsiders mistake normal evolution for hidden tension. But once people begin looking for change, they tend to find it everywhere. Scheduling became part of the discussion. Not official schedules, interpretation of schedules. Commentators pointed to overlapping appearances, rearranged timings, altered attendance patterns, details that may have meant nothing individually but appeared significant when placed together. Again, none of this confirmed conflict. Yet speculation doesn't require confirmation. It requires timing. Online conversations accelerated the process. Short observations turned into longer narratives. Neutral questions became emotional conclusions. Some insisted the gathering reflected changing influence inside royal life. Others accused commentators of projecting drama onto routine events. Two entirely different stories began forming at once. One story described adaptation. The other described discomfort. And once those stories existed, every small detail started getting assigned to one side or the other. That is the strange reality of modern monarchy. Public appearances create familiarity. Familiarity creates expectations. Expectations create interpretation. And interpretation eventually becomes its own force. Suddenly, the original question, who attended the gathering, felt less important than something more difficult to explain. People wanted to understand reaction. They wanted to understand mood. They wanted to understand what wasn't being addressed. Because if timing had amplified the moment, then absence of explanation gave it space to grow. The gathering stopped being the center of attention. Something else replaced it. Something quieter. Something harder to measure. And then attention shifted from who attended to who remained silent. No denial. No explanation. Sometimes the palace's most powerful message is saying nothing at all. And that was the point where the story changed. Until then, the discussion had still been about interpretation, who was present, what expectations existed, whether anyone had actually felt uncomfortable at all. But once attention turned toward the absence of clarification, the conversation stopped behaving like a passing rumor and started becoming something heavier. Because silence has a strange effect in royal life. It rarely closes a story. It often expands it. As conversations accelerated, observers noticed something familiar. There was no correction, but there was also no confirmation. No visible effort to reshape the narrative. No attempt to redefine what people believed they had seen. Official communication remained exactly what palace communication often is: controlled, measured, and remarkably resistant to emotional momentum. For some, that restraint meant nothing. For others, it meant everything. Royal institutions have long operated under a philosophy that explanation can sometimes create more instability than silence. The thinking, according to many commentators, is simple: respond to every interpretation, and the institution becomes reactive. Ignore every interpretation, and eventually attention moves elsewhere. At least, that is the theory. But theory and public reaction are rarely the same thing. Because modern audiences do not experience silence the way previous generations did. Silence no longer feels empty. People fill it. And once people begin filling gaps, they do so with stories. Commentary emerged from every direction. Some voices argued the entire situation had been exaggerated from the beginning, that nothing unusual had happened, and that the absence of response reflected confidence rather than discomfort. Others interpreted the silence as intentional distance, not denial, not agreement, just a quiet refusal to participate in narratives unfolding outside palace walls. Then came a third interpretation, the most dramatic one. That silence itself was becoming communication. That saying nothing was not avoiding the story, it was shaping it. Those interpretations spread because they appealed to something people already believe about monarchy, that important things are rarely spoken directly, and whether that belief is fair or not almost stopped mattering. People started reading meaning into details that had never been explained. Why no clarification? Why no visible adjustment? Why allow interpretation to continue? Questions multiplied faster than answers. What made the moment more complicated was that every conclusion seemed to support itself. If nothing happened, silence made sense. If something did happen, silence also made sense. Every theory found validation in the same absence. And that is where speculation becomes difficult to contain. Because people are not just responding to events anymore. They are responding to uncertainty. Some began describing the moment as evidence of changing dynamics. Others called that interpretation unfair and overly dramatic. But even critics of the speculation admitted something uncomfortable. The public wasn't reacting to one private gathering. They were reacting to accumulated impressions. Small moments remembered later. Tiny changes people thought they had noticed. Patterns they could not fully explain. And once those memories entered the conversation, the silence around this moment started feeling less isolated than before. Because whether those observations meant anything or nothing at all, many people had already convinced themselves that something had been shifting for much longer. But long before this moment, observers had already noticed subtle changes. One moment becomes gossip. A pattern becomes a headline. That is the point where royal stories stop belonging to the people involved and begin belonging to everyone else. By now, the original question had become almost impossible to separate from everything attached to it. The gathering. The exit. The silence afterward. None of those details existed alone anymore. They had been absorbed into something larger, a growing habit of interpretation that follows modern royal life everywhere it goes. And once that process begins, every movement starts carrying meaning. Not because meaning is actually there, but because people become convinced it must be. Royal coverage has always operated in this unusual space between observation and imagination. Public appearances are formal, measured, controlled. Yet audiences rarely consume them as formal events. They consume them emotionally. They search for reassurance, distance, affection, friction. They watch not just what is said, but how long someone pauses before speaking. That instinct is not new, but it has become faster. Commentary now forms in real time. An appearance ends, and interpretations begin immediately. Expressions become narratives. Timing becomes symbolism. Silence becomes strategy. Within that environment, the reported private gathering became almost secondary. Attention shifted toward something much more subjective. Reaction. People revisited public moments that had nothing to do with the original story. Ordinary appearances suddenly gained new interpretations. Commentators discussed tone, presence, energy. Familiar interactions were re-examined as though they contained hidden meaning waiting to be unlocked. Some observers insisted they noticed differences. Others argued they were watching normal human behavior being transformed into mythology. And that distinction matters. Because there is a danger hidden inside royal storytelling. The more symbolism people expect to find, the easier it becomes to mistake ordinary moments for extraordinary signals. A brief exchange becomes evidence. A delayed response becomes intention. A schedule adjustment becomes conflict. Eventually, even neutrality starts looking strategic. That does not stop fascination. If anything, it intensifies it. Royal coverage culture thrives in uncertainty because uncertainty allows everyone to participate. One person sees professionalism. Another sees discomfort. A third sees absolutely nothing unusual at all. And all three interpretations can appear persuasive at the same time. That is why stories like this grow. Not because facts expand. Because narratives do. The gathering became less important than what people believed it represented. For some, it became a story about changing relationships. For others, it reflected the impossible expectations placed on public figures. For others still, it became an example of how quickly modern audiences construct emotional conclusions from incomplete information. But none of those interpretations erased the feeling that had begun to settle in. A feeling that this moment had attached itself to something deeper. Because even people skeptical of the speculation admitted there was one thing they could not dismiss. Stories like this rarely become widespread without connecting to emotions people already carry. Questions about change. Questions about influence. Questions about who shapes the atmosphere around an institution built on continuity. And once those questions appear, they almost never remain small. Because royal narratives have a habit of expanding beyond personalities. They become conversations about roles, about expectations, about the future. And when that happens, what started as a private moment stops feeling private at all. Yet insiders say royal stories rarely stay personal for long. The monarchy survives not through speed but through discipline. That may be the hardest part of royal life for modern audiences to accept. Because in an age where every headline demands immediate reaction and every rumor expects instant clarification, institutions built on centuries of continuity often move in the opposite direction. They slow down, they wait, they absorb pressure rather than answer it. And whether people admire that approach or find it frustrating, it shapes almost every public moment. By the time discussion around the gathering reached full momentum, another question had started to emerge beneath the speculation. Why wasn't anyone trying to stop it? The answer many royal observers point to is not secrecy. It is philosophy. Palace communication has long been built around a belief that visibility and accessibility are not the same thing. The public is invited to witness certain parts of royal life, but not all of it. Statements exist. Appearances exist. Traditions exist. But explanation has limits. The reasoning, according to many who study royal communications, is institutional rather than emotional. If every rumor receives a response, every rumor becomes important. So restraint becomes strategy. That restraint can appear cold from the outside. But internally, supporters of the approach argue that it serves a different purpose, protecting continuity from becoming dependent on daily reaction, which creates a difficult balance. Because public expectations have changed, people no longer want only ceremony. They want access, context, clarification. They want institutions to speak with the speed and transparency expected from public figures elsewhere. The monarchy operates differently, not because it ignores public interest, but because historically, it has treated over-explanation as its own risk. That difference creates tension. When audiences ask questions and receive silence, they often interpret silence emotionally. When institutions stay silent intentionally, they interpret that same silence structurally. Those two worlds rarely meet comfortably. So the conversation around this moment continued. Commentary expanded. Some argued the palace had handled the situation exactly as expected, remaining measured, refusing to validate speculation, protecting private relationships from public storytelling. Others believed the lack of response allowed interpretation to become stronger than reality. And maybe that is the paradox. Respond too quickly, and the institution appears reactive. Respond too slowly, and people begin creating answers on their own. Every royal household eventually faces that impossible calculation. Protect privacy, maintain visibility, offer reassurance, avoid overexposure, do all of it at once. That balancing act becomes even more complicated, because public fascination does not distinguish between official life and personal life. A formal appearance can become personal commentary overnight. A private moment can become institutional symbolism by morning, which means the palace is often responding to something larger than a single rumor. It is responding to the possibility of setting expectations for the next one. And that may explain why stories like this are rarely interrupted directly. Not because every interpretation is meaningful, but because sometimes the institution believes attention moves faster than correction ever could. Still, that approach comes with a cost. Because when explanation does not arrive, attention rarely disappears. It redirects. Questions stop focusing on systems. They return to people, to expressions, to choices, to the person everyone believed they had been reading all along. And eventually, attention returned to Catherine herself. The most discussed moment wasn't what Catherine said, it was that she didn't say anything at all. By the time attention circled back to her, something unusual had happened. The story had detached itself from the original event. People were no longer debating guest lists or timing with the same intensity. They were studying something far more subjective. Presence, restraint, interpretation. And once a public figure becomes the center of interpretation instead of information, every absence begins to feel deliberate even when it not be. That is what made this moment so difficult to define. There was no public confrontation to examine, no statement to analyze, no explanation to challenge. There was only silence and the meaning people attached to it. For many observers, that silence became evidence of composure. One interpretation framed Catherine's reaction, or perceived reaction, as a reflection of the role she has often been associated with: publicly, measured, controlled, and resistant to emotional display. In this reading, saying less was not avoidance. It was discipline. Others viewed it differently. They questioned whether restraint should always be interpreted as strength. They argued that public expectations sometimes reward silence so heavily that people begin projecting impossible levels of meaning onto ordinary human behavior. And somewhere between those positions, the conversation kept expanding. Because public perception rarely settles. It evolves. Commentary across media spaces reflected that divide. Some people praised what they interpreted as professionalism. Others wondered whether professionalism itself had become part of the pressure. Questions emerged that had little to do with the original moment. How much emotion are public figures allowed to show? At what point does dignity become distance? When does privacy become mystery? No one had clear answers, but people kept asking. That is the paradox of royal storytelling. Visibility creates familiarity. Familiarity creates expectation. Expectation creates interpretation. And interpretation eventually becomes stronger than observable reality. The more people searched for meaning in silence, the more silence appeared meaningful. Yet uncertainty remained impossible to escape. Every confident theory seemed to meet another equally convincing explanation. If composure was intentional, it suggested control. If composure was simply normal behavior, then the speculation itself became the story. If nothing unusual happened at all, then public reaction revealed more than the event ever did. And slowly attention started shifting again. Not toward evidence, not toward confirmation, toward emotion. People became invested in what they believed moments represented, rather than what could actually be known. That shift changed everything. Because once public conversation becomes emotional, certainty stops being necessary. People stop asking what happened. They start asking what it meant. The reported gathering became a mirror. Some saw tension. Some saw professionalism. Some saw nothing except a familiar cycle repeating itself again. And perhaps that was always the most revealing part, not the event, not the reaction, not even the silence, but the fact that thousands of people could watch the same story unfold and arrive at entirely different conclusions, which leaves one final question lingering beneath everything that came before. What if the real story was never about disagreement at all? What if it was about what people expected to find? Because perhaps the biggest story wasn't conflict, it was perception. Royal history isn't written in private rooms, it's written in what people believe happened inside them. And perhaps that is where this story finally arrives, not at certainty, but at perspective. Because after all the discussion, all the interpretations, all the questions about timing, presence, silence, and reaction, one uncomfortable truth remains. Nobody outside that room truly knows what happened. That reality has not stopped the story. If anything, it is the reason the story endured. The reported gathering became larger than the event itself, because modern royal narratives rarely survive on confirmed details alone. They spread through atmosphere, through interpretation, through fragments connected together until they begin to feel complete. One person notices timing, another notices silence. Someone else remembers a previous appearance, connects it to a newer moment, and suddenly an entire explanation begins forming from pieces that may never have belonged together in the first place. That does not make people irrational. It makes them human. The monarchy has always existed in this unusual space between public access and private distance. People are invited close enough to feel invested, but never close enough to see everything. That space creates fascination. Fascination creates interpretation. And interpretation becomes its own kind of history. That may explain why stories surrounding royal life often feel bigger than ordinary public events. They are rarely about one conversation. They become reflections of larger questions. Questions about tradition. Questions about change. Questions about how institutions survive while the world around them changes faster every year. And perhaps that is why this moment captured attention in the first place. Not because there was a confirmed disagreement. Not because there was a proven slight. Not because anyone emerged victorious. There was no clear confrontation. No official explanation. No final revelation. Only competing interpretations layered over a brief moment and expanded into something much larger. Some people saw professionalism. Others saw discomfort. Some believed boundaries had shifted. Others believed nothing unusual happened at all. And all of those readings continued existing side by side, because no definitive answer arrived to replace them. Maybe that uncertainty is the real ending. Because royal stories often resist clean conclusions. They remain suspended between public memory and private reality. The institution continues. Appearances continue. Schedules move forward. New headlines replace old ones. But moments like this stay behind not because they were necessarily historic, but because people remember how they felt while watching them unfold. And perhaps that feeling matters more than certainty ever could. The monarchy has survived wars, transitions, reinventions, and generations of scrutiny not by controlling every narrative, but by allowing time to do what statements sometimes cannot. Time softens speculation. Time reshapes interpretation. Time turns headlines into footnotes. Yet curiosity remains. That curiosity is part of the story too. Because long after names, schedules, and rumors fade, people will still ask the same questions they always have. What happened? What did it mean? And were we ever really watching the event, or only ourselves reflected inside it? In the end, the walkout may never be fully explained, but the reaction to it revealed far more than the moment itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.